Lando Norris takes a further chunk out of Max Verstappen's lead in the Drivers' Championship after a quite sensational performance in the Singapore Grand Prix. However, the big story of the day for the fourth day in a row in Singapore surrounds Max Verstappen and his continued frustration with the FIA. From Racing News 365, my name is Nick Golding, and I'm delighted to be joined, as always, by lead editor Ian Parks. Ian, a phenomenal performance by Norris, but we have to start with Verstappen once again because the escalation between him and his frustrations with the FIA has gone a step further, with the Dutchman now stating he could retire from F1 early.
4 days I've been here in Singapore, Nick, and 4 consecutive days Max Verstappen has now dominated the headlines around this Grand Prix. On Thursday, of course, during the driver's press conference, he used the F word, coming just hours after the president, FIA President Mohammed bin Sulayem, had turned round and basically said that he did not want the drivers to swear anymore. That was predominantly aimed at audio played out during a Grand Prix that we hear over team radio. This was actually Max using the F word during the driver's press conference on this occasion. That, however, on Friday, landed him in hot water with the FIA because he was summoned to the stewards to answer a charge of using foul language, which is against the FIA International Sporting Code. He was punished for that, basically given a community service penalty in which he has to do good deeds on behalf of the FIA towards the F1 public. Then on Thursday, of course, after he had surprisingly qualified for second on the grid around the Marina Bay Street circuit, during the official post-qualifying press conference, he basically took it upon himself to barely answer any of the questions that were put to him. He was very succinct, very curt in his replies, and he then conducted a separate post-media scrum away from the FIA press conference room. Again, today, as after finishing second to Lando Norris, quite a distant second as well at that, we had a similar scenario. Yes, he took and answered questions. They were, again, rather short answers. He basically turned around and said, I don't have to answer. I know I have to answer, but it doesn't mean I have to give long answers. And that's exactly what he did. So once again, having finished his official FIA media duties with that press conference, there was a 10-minute sit down with Max on the Red Bull paddock building, just about 20 meters away from where I'm standing right now. And yes, during that 20-minute briefing, and I want to quote him accurately, so I'm going to refer to my notebook, he basically described again this punishment as super silly. What really annoyed him is that he mentioned that earlier this year, he's already carried out a lot of work for the FIA, helping with junior stewards. So here he is again, having already done some good deeds, and he feels this punishment, bearing in mind that work that he's done, was totally unfair. He said he's got no desire to give long answers. He doesn't have a bad relationship with the FIA, and he has done them little favours along the way. And for those little favours, he feels he deserves greater respect than he's been shown. Primarily, though, Nick, and relating to your question, of course, I will quote him here. He said, these things decide my future if you can't be yourself. You don't want to deal with all of this. It's really tiring. Dealing with silly things that is not a way continuing in the sport. So this incident over these past 2 days has now really got him thinking. Yes, he's got these next few weeks to think about because we've got quite a long gap now between the Singapore Grand Prix and the United States Grand Prix. Obviously, he's not going to walk away straight away, and we've heard Max talk about these silly things in the past, the sprint races, these all, but this is now all adding up for him. And this is just the latest thing that is slowly making him consider his ongoing presence in the sport.
And we will talk about the swearing, the whole topic in particular, in much more detail in the podcast. But actually, this whole thing with Max and the FIA in Singapore has completely overshadowed what's been a really surprising weekend for him and Red Bull, who were not expecting to be on the podium this weekend, let alone on the front row in qualifying. Max finishing second, and his good friend Daniel Ricciardo in what looks likely to potentially be his last race of at least this season, nicking the fastest lap point from Lando Norris on the final lap, meaning that with Lando winning, despite McLaren's significant advantage in Singapore, it's only another 7 points taken from Max's lead down to 52 points. So all in all, for Red Bull on the circuit, yes, Sergio Perez was in 10th. It's been quite a positive weekend for Max and the team.
It has, on track, as you say,
On
really
track.
positive, because even Max, particularly after Friday, and it was a really poor performance from that RB20. It was pretty much as Red Bull were expecting that car to perform. It was off the pace. They looked again as if it was not going to qualify for Q3, as they failed to do in last year's Singapore Grand Prix, neither car getting into the top 10 shootout. But lo and behold, and as we discussed on the update post-qualifying, just where on earth did that performance come from, in particular on Max Verstappen's side of the garage? Yes, as I mentioned, Max is a wonderful driver. We all know that, a super talent. And you only got to look at the distance between himself and Checo Perez, who, of course, did not make it into Q3. So they've definitely managed to do something with that car. They managed to get a good qualifying performance out of it. And ultimately, they managed to get really good race pace out of it as well, because whilst Max threatens over the first 2 laps, maybe, once Lando managed to break out of DRS range, and that was it. He was gone into the distance, just as Mercedes driver George Russell had predicted. Interestingly enough, this was the first time Lando Norris had started on pole position and had actually converted that into leading by the end of lap 1. So tremendous performance from him. Yes, as you say, he's eaten into that lead now, but only by 7 points. Funny enough, Nick, and we will get on to Daniel Ricciardo in particular, nicking that fastest lap point right at the end. If you hadn't have done that, Lando Norris would have taken 8 points out of Max. The gap between the two would then have been 51 points. I calculated, and I know this is a ridiculous, it would never have happened scenario. If Lando and Max had finished 1-2 in the remaining 6 Grand Prix and 1-2 in the 3 sprint sessions that we've got coming up as well, they, by the end of this season, they would have finished dead level on points. Lando would take a title on the basis of having won more Grand Prix this year than Max. As I say, I know, stupid I know though, because that was where my brain was at that particular time. But you know what? Now it's 52 points. So yes, Max Verstappen has got that little bit of an edge. And Lando knows that he's going to need a little bit of a helping hand over this 6 Grand Prix and 3 sprints. But where is that Red Bull car going to be at come Austin? Because it was not expected to perform around here. So does that bode well for the team, for Max, going forward into these 2 triple headers that we've got to conclude this incredible, so far, record-breaking 24 Grand Prix season?
And of course, Red Bull as well do possibly have significant upgrades for that American triple header coming up in just under a month's time. But let's talk about Lando Norris and McLaren, because Lando finally made a good start from pole position, ultimately cruised to victory just over 21 seconds. Almost Zandvoort-esque the way he dominated the Dutch Grand Prix, but spectacular from Lando. A couple of brushes with the wall, one more significant than another, which almost binned and ended his race. But importantly, McLaren has extended its lead over Red Bull to 41 points. Oscar Piastri doing very well to recover from qualifying behind both Mercedes, finished ahead of them. Didn't quite have the pace to catch Max due to the gap between them. But first and third for McLaren, another win for Lando. That's a good day in the office for Andrea Stella.
Very good day in the office, but oh my word, how very nearly it wasn't. You touched on that little wall brush. Yeah, he had a little bit of a lock-up. And as he came out of that turn, he reported front wing damage. And of course, he continued on for one more lap. And I just assume, bearing in mind that Max had pitted and he was obviously wary of what might go on there, that they were obviously conscious. They just wanted to check that front wing damage. Did they have to change the front wing? Because, of course, that would have cost a lot more time in his pit stop. Thankfully for Lando Norris, that was not the case. But even so, even after that pit stop, he still had one more sagebrush through the wall. That was a lot more minor than the one he'd had previously. But my word, how very close he came to this not being his dream weekend. Because that's what it has been at the end of the day for him. It was nearly what we describe in F1 as the Grand Chelem, because he took pole, he took the race win, he led every lap of that race victory, and the Grand Chelem means that you also take the fastest lap. However, and we have mentioned it previously, Daniel Ricciardo denied in that fastest lap point in a clever bit of strategy between the two Red Bull family teams.
Definitely. We'll talk about Ricciardo at the end of the show, because let's now discuss Mercedes, because George Russell in fourth, Lewis Hamilton, a difficult race in sixth, but neither driver attended the post-race media pen.
Remarkable. We were standing there, myself and my colleagues, in the media pen, where all the drivers do their TV interviews, and then they come across to us written media to do their sessions as well. And then we heard from one of the FIA representatives that George and Lewis would not be attending, that they were feeling unwell. Apparently the heat had got to them. Now, we know that Mercedes W15 cockpit, because we've heard it from Lewis only recently, has been getting rather hot. Lewis has been complaining about a hot seat within his car. George in particular bemoaned his car during this Grand Prix, that it was increasingly so more and more like a sauna. So you can only imagine how those two guys must have looked getting out of their cars. And then you saw something similar, if you remembered it, in the Qatar Grand Prix at the end there, where every driver was affected, but most definitely for Mercedes and that car in particular, it was created a lot of problems for George and Lewis. And in the end, as we've mentioned, they were unable to go through with their normal media duties, which they would have seen them still in their overalls, going around the pen and probably spending 15, 20 minutes in that pen, because the drivers don't really have time to change. Just to give you some idea, folks, they're normally straight out of their cars, they're taken straight to the pen, and they're conducting their interviews. They're all, and particularly a place like this, they're going to be hot, they're going to be sweaty, or with not much of a chance to cool down. Then George and Lewis were really, really feeling it today. So yeah, hopefully they should be okay, over the next few days or so.
I think after a few ice baths, I think they'll probably be okay. But actually, it's funny you mention also the heat, because actually for the first time in the history of the Singapore Grand Prix, not one yellow flag, not one safety car. I don't know what's happening with safety cars in F1 at the moment, but they're just not happening. It's almost like safety cars no longer exist. And that would have helped out Ferrari if there was a safety car, because obviously Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz started 9th and 10th. A lot of drivers attempted a very, very long first stint in the hope of a safety car. Of course, that safety car never come, but Leclerc doing very well in P5 and Carlos Sainz P7 for Ferrari. Given how difficult overtaking is in Singapore, that's a positive afternoon. Well, night.
Yeah, I think as a safety car would have helped a lot of people. But as you say, this is the 15th Singapore Grand Prix, and it's the first time we have never had a safety car. Quite remarkable. Just getting on to Ferrari, yes, a decent day in the office, bearing in mind the troubles that they had in qualifying. Now, if you watched Saturday night's F1 update, you would have heard me talking about Charles Leclerc being very, very critical of his team, bemoaning the fact that his tyres were effectively 10 degrees below temperature. Well, in the post-race tonight, he actually held his hand up and said, "Sorry, guys, it wasn't my team's fault. It was actually my fault that I didn't get those tyres up to temperature." So that was very honest of him, at least, to say that. So to come away with a 5th place finish, yeah, not too bad a result for him. And as you say, Carlos 7th. I think that was the best that they could possibly do, those guys, given the circumstances. I asked both Charles and Carlos on the back of this whether they felt that Ferrari were still in the Constructors' Championship hunt, and just quickly looking at their 75 points adrift of McLaren. Still an awful lot of points to play for. Yeah. We got some tracks coming up that should be quite good for Ferrari, but of course that McLaren, as we've seen for over these past 4 Grand Prix since returning from the summer break, it is a car for all tracks. Both of them conceded that maybe now it's looking a little bit too much for Ferrari, that maybe catching Red Bull, finishing second would be a good place to be at the end of the season. Not where Ferrari wants to be, of course. It wants to be winning the Constructors' Championship, but it's not done for an awful long time now. But yes, they're still chasing Red Bull. They've got Red Bull in their sights. McLaren is looking too good for McLaren right now, so both conceding that maybe it's a little bit too much work to do for Ferrari to win the Constructors' Championship this season.
Definitely. And just before we get on to our final talking point, I'll go through the top 10 from the Singapore Grand Prix very quickly. Lando Norris came out victorious ahead of Max Verstappen. Oscar Piastri completed the podium in third, ahead of Russell in fourth, Leclerc in fifth, Lewis Hamilton and Carlos Sainz in sixth and seventh. Fernando Alonso did brilliantly for P8, as did Nico Hulkenberg for P9, 2 more points for Haas, before Sergio Perez completed the top 10 in P10. We've got to finish on Daniel Ricciardo. We obviously spoke about him across the weekend and how it looks likely this is his at least last weekend of the season before likely being replaced by Liam Lawson for the final 6 races. He did brilliantly to nick that fastest lap point from Lando Norris, but he did seem quite an emotional character after the race.
Yeah, it was very poignant interview actually with the written media that took place, and Daniel was, as you say, he wasn't choking, but you could certainly tell in his answers to the questions that were being put to him that there was a degree of emotion behind those thoughts and words. And let's just get on to what he did during the Grand Prix initially. Started on the soft tyre, quite an aggressive strategy, really didn't work, really didn't pay off for him. And with him running towards the back end of the field, where Red Bull decided to roll the dice, and obviously, as mentioned, Lando Norris was running with that fastest lap point in the bag, right at the death. RB pulled in Daniel Ricciardo, strapped him onto another set of soft tyres, and lo and behold, who got that fastest lap. Doesn't get a point for it, of course, because he finished outside the top 10. You have to finish inside the top 10 to pick up the fastest lap point. But what he did do, by taking the fastest lap away from Lando Norris, was, of course, he's nicked what would potentially be a very valuable point away from the British driver. And then, as I touched on earlier, with regard to his interview, he turned around and said that he's realistic about what the situation is going to be. We're expecting an announcement at some stage over the course of the next week. The fact that this is it for Daniel Ricciardo has had his time with RB to try and resurrect his Formula One career. And it is going to be Liam Lawson alongside Yuki Tsunoda going forward into the last 6 Grand Prix. RB now in a really tough, tight fight with Haas for 6th place in the Constructors' Championship. I mean, 3 points separate those 2 teams. I was very lucky to give Daniel Ricciardo a hearty handshake when he had concluded his written media interviews, and there was a little look in our eyes towards one another, and because I've always got on really well with Daniel over the years, he's always given me some smashing interviews. He's been a real character, a real breath of fresh air for this sport over the time that he has graced it. And as he made his way out of the written pen and towards the RB paddock building, there was a group of people at the entrance to that paddock building, and they were doing one of those slow hand claps that it eventually builds up and gets louder and louder and louder until then Daniel made his way up the steps into the paddock building. That for me was very poignant and again emotional as well. And heaven only knows how he was feeling at that particular point, and heaven only knows how he's going to be feeling on the long way home back to Australia for him. He's had a wonderful career. Everybody knows it. It's not quite worked out for him since he left Red Bull at the end of 2018. But my word, he has done so much for the sport, and we wish him well in whatever might be coming next, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. His personality, more than anything, would miss so much because he is such a character Ian, amazing stuff as always in the hot and humid Singapore. I've got to thank our viewers firstly for putting up with my awful voice the last few days because the flu is currently winning. It's flu 1, Nick nil, but also for 10,000 subscribers. It's a huge achievement for us and we're just going to keep on growing. For myself and Ian, this has been the post-race F1 update. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and we will see you on Monday for the podcast. See you later.
Take care as always, folks. Thank you for watching.